Good evening. Can you all hear me all right? No? Okay. My name is Sherry Riley, and I'm the Director of Campus Ministry, and I also coordinate the Charity, Justice, and Peace programming at St. Thomas Aquinas. And I'm very happy to have you all here tonight. Our speaker is Tom Chapman, and the reason we invited him is in this year of election, we know that immigration is just high on everybody's list of interest, especially in light of the raids in Marshalltown a couple of years ago and Postville in this past year, and all of the fallout that's happened here in Iowa, along with everything that's going on in the country. But let me tell you a little bit about Tom before we get started. About 17 years ago, Tom Chapman responded to the call to accept the position of Director of Communications for the Diocese of Des Moines. As Director of Communications, he among his duties there, he edited their diocesan paper for about 10 years. And then he was appointed Chancellor of the diocese. And the Chancellor is essentially the Chief of Staff for a diocese. And with that, he worked along with parish pastoral councils to try and develop more pastoral ways of working within parishes so that pastoral councils had more input with priests and parishes were more collaborative in ministry with lay people and ordained. And then 2 years ago, he was appointed Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference. And what this requires of him is a lot of travel because he's responsible for formation and voter education throughout all 4 dioceses of Iowa. And so he's been traveling a lot lately, giving workshops on faithful citizenship and voter education. And, responding to questions about, well, what can the Catholic Church say about politics? How can people who are Catholic be politically involved? What can Catholic churches say and not say about who to elect? Those sorts of things. In addition to that, he lobbies on behalf of the Iowa bishops, all 4 of them, based on the legislative priorities that are set by a board of 25 people, including the 4 bishops and several lay and ordained people throughout Iowa, who come together every year to set up the legislative agenda for the Iowa Catholic Conference. Tom and his wife, Paulette, live in Des Moines, and they have 3 children. 1 is a preschooler, and then 2 are in high school. And so I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming Tom as he comes to talk to us about immigration this evening. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Sherry, very much. Tonight, for the next 45 minutes or so, I just want to tell you a little bit about the immigration situation that we have in this country, a short overview of what the legal system actually is and isn't. And then we'll talk about what kind of reform that we think are necessary, because I think all the parties on this particular issue, whether they're really for or against or whatever, most people feel that there is a definite need for reform of our immigration system. And so what we're trying to do with the Catholic Church is try to set up some principles and then actually make some public policy recommendations that I'll talk to about some of those tonight. And I think it's important for you to know that I do come to this as an advocate. I'm not an immigration attorney. I'm not a trade specialist, I'm not Homeland Security. I come to this as a believer. I'm a member of the Catholic Church and really want to put out and advocate for what we think is important in terms of immigration reform. As you'll see tonight, and many of you already know, this is a very complex problem. It's a lot more complex than is easily understood by the media. Right now when you do an interview, usually you can get about 4 seconds out. They use 4-second sound bites. And an issue like this does not admit very easily to that kind of discussion. And so I think I really welcome the time that we're going to have tonight to go over this issue a little bit. I'd certainly welcome any questions that you have. I'll certainly have question time at the end. We'll have a little discussion, in the middle as we go along tonight. But if there's anything you really want to ask and I'm not clear, make sure you point that out and we'll talk some more about that as we go along, okay? First thing I think it'd be important to talk about is what is legal immigration. And this is a very general overview of what legal immigration is in our country. The first type is family-based. and that's unlimited and limited. So if you're a citizen, you can basically have unlimited immigration if you want to bring your spouse in or bring in your children and things like that. That's basically unlimited. And that can take, depending on the situation, anywhere from 3 months to some years. If you want to bring in other family members, you can do that, like your brothers and sisters. You can bring them in from other countries, but that can take a very long time. Once again, for example, if I'm from the Philippines and I want to bring my brother or sister from the Philippines, right now that wait is more than 20 years. So it's very difficult, for families sometimes if they're in the United States to be able to bring their family members over. And that's probably appropriate in the sense that, people have to make a decision if they want to be in the United States or if they want to maybe live in their family of origin or how that works. But it certainly is possible to bring people over. It's also important to know that if you're a permanent resident, a lawful permanent resident, you can also bring some family members over. It's a much smaller circle of folks that you can bring. You can bring your spouse or your minor children or your adult unmarried children. And once again, that can be a very long wait. For example, for Mexico right now, the wait, if you're a permanent resident and want to bring somebody in from your close family, it'll take 8 years to do that. So that's the family-based immigration. And there's more or less, there's about 150,000 of these visas that are available a year. Now, there's also visas that are available that are employment-based. And that's where our society has said we believe it's important to have some categories that businesses can bring in people to be here permanently and work in the United States. And there's lots of different categories within employment-based. But they are mainly skilled workers. For the vast majority of these are skilled workers. They might have a master's degree or some kind of engineering degree, things like that, where there might be a demonstrated shortage in the United States. And so those visas are available on a permanent basis. There's also some temporary visas that are available in different categories. And people can take advantage of those temporary visas, and then sometimes they can extend that to become a permanent resident of the United States. So there's about 140,000 of those. So we got family-based and employment-based. There's also a section what we call humanitarian, and there's more or less 70,000 of those visas available in a year, mainly refugees. And so when you think of refugees, you need to think of people that have been living in camps in different parts around the world in war-torn areas. A lot of folks are coming from Africa. 10 years ago, we had a lot of people from Bosnia. There's just a ton of people that want to come to the United States, and they have to go through really 3 levels of interviews before they're allowed to come to the United States. And it could take, once you're in a refugee camp, it can be some years, at times before you can actually get to the U.S. And then it's very difficult once you're here because the government does provide some support, but not a whole lot. So it makes it difficult. But there is a path for some people from war-torn areas to come to our country. Also, seekers of asylum. There's a difference between refugees and asylees. Refugees are people who are kind of being vetted in another country. They're in a camp somewhere else. Whereas seekers of asylum have already gotten to the United States, and then they apply to get a visa as someone who needs asylum. So that might be, a perfect example might be someone from Cuba. They're trying to flee the situation there. They feel like they're in danger in that country. They come to the United States, and then they can file for asylum status, and many people will get that. Okay? One thing I think it's important to understand is that to come here legally and follow the system is not an easy thing to do in and of itself. As Sherry said, I worked as the chancellor of the Diocese of Des Moines for several years. And one of the things that was my area of responsibility was to help walk some of the priests through the religious visa process. And we had a few priests that came from Nigeria to the Diocese of Des Moines, and they came on an R1 visa. Okay, so they would be here lawfully, and then we would start the process of getting them, through the process of being able to be permanent residents of the United States. And well, in this case in particular, what would happen is, Homeland Security has total control over the situation. And so they decided in the religious visa program that they had found some areas of fraud, and I think they probably did, because one of the things you have to do is you have to prove that they have a job and prove it's a religious job and all of this. Well, they found that there was some fraud in the program, so they threw everything out. Every application they had, it was gone. And in fact, literally, they threw the paper out. I mean, everything we had sent in over a period of year was just gone. Of course, we've been through this before. We had copies of everything, But you have to get all the baptismal certificates and all the seminary, all of that. This is just to say it's not easy to get to the United States under the best of circumstances, much less if you're someone who's coming here unskilled, as a matter of fact. Let's talk a little bit about illegal immigration to the United States. I think there's some evidence that actually the number of people who are coming here without documents is actually lessening over the last couple of years. We think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we think the economy is slowing down, and I think it's pretty evident that we've all seen, particularly the last couple of weeks, what's happening with that. The economy's been slowing down, and so that's taken away some of the jobs that they may have once worked. And also, to be quite honest, they're fully aware that there's been lots of threats to have tough legislation, both at the state level and at the federal level. And that, we believe, has tended to scare some people off, for right or wrong. And if you look at the amount in terms of dollars of remittances to Mexico, a lot of people come here to work from Mexico and then they send money back. The amount of money that's being sent back to Mexico is much less now than it was even a year ago. So I think there's some pretty clear evidence that we have less immigration of undocumented people to the United States than we had. Just to give you an idea, a couple of years ago, if we did this presentation, we would have guessed that there might be maybe 1 million people a year coming from Mexico when things were really hot and heavy. Right now, we think it's about half that, maybe 500,000. And I'm not even sure if it's that, if you talk about it today. But that's kind of the general figures that seem to be out there right now. Totals in terms of the total, some estimates are there about 4% of the population in the United States are people that are undocumented, and they can come here without papers, or it could often be that they were here legal at one point. They had a temporary visa as a student or something like that, and they overstayed their visa. So they would be in that area too, but we're looking between 7 to 12 million people. But the things have changed so much to this point is that we actually think that there's fewer undocumented people coming to the United States than legal immigrants. There was a time when we thought we had more illegal than we did legal, but I think that's turned itself around just a little bit. Important thing for you to know, often you hear, and I hear this a lot when I do presentations to parishes and different groups, is that, well, why don't people just do it the right way? Why don't they just get in line and do it the right way? And I agree with that in a lot of ways, and particularly if you happen to be Catholic, we're kind of a rule-based church, and it's offensive to people that people would break the law and do something. And that's all right. I think we can understand that. It's offensive to people that when they cross a border when they shouldn't. But you need to understand that there's really no easy way to get here. Remember, we talked about employment-based visas. Now, if you look at the unskilled category of employment-based visas, permanent green cards, there's $5,000 a year for the whole country. Now, we could probably use $5,000 a year in Iowa, or pretty close to that, just for Iowa in our perspective. But that's $5,000 a year for the whole country. And so if you were going to come to this country and you needed to get here, you wanted to feed your family, you really needed to get out of poverty and come to the United States, you would have had to have applied in January of 2002 to get here today. And I think you see certainly our perspective on that is if someone is in need, that's really too long a wait. It's too long a wait to get here. So 5,000 visas a year. All of this is in with the perspective that we have spent a ton of money on the border. Probably over the last 15 years, we have quadrupled our spending, on the border for enforcement. We spent more than $25 billion. Now, that sounds like a big amount, or at least it used to until a week or two ago. $25 billion sounds big. Well, we just had our $700 billion bailout. But still, $25 billion is a lot of money. And we spent a lot of money on this, and it still wasn't effective. People were still coming through our borders because they really wanted to get here. I think that's important to remember. And we also should really be honest about the fact that their very presence here is not a criminal case. It's more along the lines of a civil, speeding ticket, their actual presence here. Now, if people steal a Social Security number, that's a felony, okay? But just to be here is not a felony in the United States. You have any questions about that part so far in terms of the details? Oh, thank you. Diversity visas, it's a very small number of diversity visas are available. It's basically from countries that don't send many people to the United States. And so they allot a certain number of visas for each of those countries to send some people here. And so, Mexico, Korea, those countries are not going to get any diversity visas, but it's mainly in Africa. And there's somewhere around 50,000 diversity visas. The other thing you got to remember about all of these visas is that they're not all used up in a year just because our system is really slow to go through all of these, and they don't roll over to the next year. So why we say there's 140,000 visas available or 70,000 for refugees, they might only fill 40 out of that 70,000. And they don't roll over to the next year. It's not like the commercial for the cell phone minutes. They don't roll over. It's just for the 1 year. And then once we hit October 1st, it's a whole new year. There's a lot of assertions that are made about what people who are here illegally. And I say, undocumented immigrants. I don't say illegal immigrants. And the reason for that is I don't think people are illegal. They do illegal things. But I might slip up every once in a while, and I don't want to get hung up on that terminology. But that's why we say people who are undocumented. Anyway, I think it's important that people really know what the situation is in terms of what benefits they actually can receive by being in this country and what contributions they make. And then we can make better public policy decisions. And there's a lot of blowhards out there, and probably a few on both sides, that will make some assertions that aren't really true. And I think it's important to try to get the facts. And towards the end of our presentation, we'll talk a little bit about where I think you can find some really good facts on the situation. But it's one thing that anybody can get who's in this country is they can get emergency room care. Okay, they can get emergency room care. Their children can be educated in the public school system. That's a benefit that they actually receive. And then, of course, they receive the benefits of our public safety system. So if someone's here illegally and they call the fire department still comes. They call the police department still comes. Some things they can't get, they can't participate in the nutrition program. It used to be called the food stamp program. They can't participate in that. They're not eligible for Medicaid health insurance or Hawkeye, which is Iowa's plan for kids to help people afford health insurance. They're not eligible for that. So there's really no other direct benefits. Now, if immigrants' children that are born in the United States, those kids are citizens. And so they can get food assistance and other assistance as any other citizen can. But the people who are not citizens cannot get those. In fact, people who are here lawfully have a 5-year wait before they can access Medicaid or anything like that. So that's what they can get. Now, we've got some estimates that we look at nationwide, and our estimate is between half and 3/4 of immigrants who are here illegally pay payroll taxes and Social Security taxes. And they would do that either by getting a taxpayer number from the IRS or having a fake or stolen Social Security number. And so that's how they end up paying payroll taxes. So we think of between half and 3/4 do. Of course, everyone who's here pays sales tax. That's just part of the deal. And we all help pay property taxes if we're renters. And so that's another part of their contribution back to the community. We helped put together a study that was done by the Iowa Policy Project that took a look at, just here in Iowa, what were some of the benefits that were received and some of the payments from immigrants. Looking at the undocumented, what their assumption is an average income of about $27,400 a year for the family. And based on that, they said that the undocumented immigrants contributed as direct contributions between $40 and $64 million back into Iowa, into taxes in the tax system in Iowa. They also estimated if they were all kicked out, it would cost us about $4 billion in business once it was all said and done. They also, this was another group, did a study of some of the small towns in Iowa that had a high immigrant population. And it showed that a majority of the people interviewed thought that the immigrants had rescued their town. And this is an important point to talk about in terms of workforce here in Iowa. Certainly the little towns that are growing tend to have immigrants. The little towns that don't have immigrants aren't growing. So that's just part of that whole picture. Then nationwide, they estimate that unauthorized people contribute $7 billion to Social Security. My point being is, we could talk a lot about what number really applies and what number doesn't apply and how much is it. But the point being, we should talk about the benefits that they do receive being here in this country, but I think it's important to realize the contributions that they make back and to have some balance towards that. I'm going to spend a couple minutes here. I want to tell you a little bit about my immigration background. Just for a minute. I've got different parts of the family, as you all have. One part of my family's been here for a couple hundred years from England. They came over very early. More recently, I had a bunch of one side of my family came from Ireland. And then most recently, on my grandparents, they came from Luxembourg over to the United States after World War I, or very early after World War I. When they were occupied by Germany. And a lot of the people from Luxembourg came to have a better life for themselves and actually to get out from under the Germans in some respects. Just a little word of advice as an aside. Don't ever tell your grandmother, about her heritage from Germany if they're from Luxembourg. That's a big mistake. It's not Germany. It's not Germany. So I think it'd be interesting if you could just kind of look at the person or, talk with the person next to you for a minute and talk a little bit about your immigration story. Where did your family come from? How long have you been here? And if you know, why did they come to the United States? And we'll just do this for 2 minutes. Okay, I hate to interrupt you, but we'll come back here for a minute. I always say that I never pick on anyone in the front row. Well, there's no one in the front row, so I can't do that. Is there anybody that wants to volunteer and just say a little bit about their situation?
Well, actually, I'm currently a student in Iowa State. I'm a freshman, but I've lived in Iowa about 2 years. And my mom is actually from Spain, but my dad is from Trinidad. I was born in Venezuela, but with this whole origin, I moved to Iowa 2 years ago. So I went to high school here, I graduated here, and now I'm going to college here. So hopefully someday legally I'll become a citizen. That's
so
my
you're
goal.
Here for education?
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Let's do a couple more. We have a lot of people from the Native American tribes here tonight, I can see. Anyone else?
Hi. I was born here, but both my parents are from Mexico. They came here to go to graduate school and then in turn give us a better life once they had us after the education part. And all of my extended family, except for one uncle, is still in Mexico. So, yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. When I was preparing this presentation, I have a 14-year-old son. And as he hears the word immigration from me over the last couple of years, he kind of rolls his eyes as only a 14-year-old boy can do. I mean, he's heard it so many times, he just can't handle it. And I finally said, and I didn't think of it before, and I finally said it. I said, Michael, you realize that you're an immigrant. He said, well, what are you talking about? I said, Michael, you're from Korea. You had a green card. You became a citizen. You're an immigrant. The thought had never occurred to him, and I think, honestly, never occurred to him. I mean, he's half African American, half Korean. It never occurred to him that he wasn't, that he was actually an immigrant, but he was. And for me, it's like it made me think about how little I think about my heritage, And so many of us are really within the last couple of generations have come to this country. And that really made me think about, we do a great job in this country of thinking of ourselves as Americans. And that's one of the strong points that we have in our country. But some of the times we forget about our heritage as immigrants. And of course, the point with all of this is that, for the vast majority of us, immigration is not an old story in our family. If we look at the kind of the sweep of the last 50 years or 100 years, the vast majority of us had family members who came from another country to the United States. And typically it's for the same reason, is that people are here to make a better life for themselves. They're here to work. They're here to improve their life for whatever reason. In some cases, it literally is to feed their families. And I think you saw some of this in Postville, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the situation in Postville, many people from Guatemala really did come here to help feed their families because they really saw that they could try to make some money in the United States. But why should they have to do this? I mean, why aren't there more opportunities in Mexico or Guatemala and things like that? And certainly from the perspective of the Catholic Church and the Catholic bishops, there are big global forces at work. There's a growing gap between rich and poor people around the world. Here in the United States, we have a great demand for a cheap source of labor, and illegal immigration helps with that. And we also have some trade policies that has affected the economy in some countries, notably Mexico. And this is really Economics 101. And I said I'm not an economist and I'm an advocate. But Economics 101 is that labor moves to a higher paying market. And so if people think that they can make a better, make a difference for their family to go somewhere else, they will work very hard to do that. They would prefer to do it at home. But they think they've got a better shot at it here. According to the World Bank, 50% of the population in Mexico lives in poverty. There's lots of foreign debt. There's a ton of unemployed people. Maybe a third of the people are unemployed. Wages are low. Now, one of the things that's happened with the last 15 years that has really exacerbated the situation, we know there's been illegal immigration for a long time, but one of the things that made it worse, we believe, was NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It didn't provide for equal protections in all countries in terms of minimum wage and work standards, that sort of thing. At the time, supporters of NAFTA thought that it would help decrease illegal immigration because there'd be more opportunities in each of the countries. It didn't work out that way. One of the reasons it didn't work out that way is that the treaty had Mexico open its markets to grain, corn and wheat primarily, particularly yellow corn, which is used for animals. They opened up their markets. Our corn exports to Mexico have tripled over that time. And what's happened is in Mexico is that they can't compete. Because we still have subsidies here in the United States, too. They had to take their tariffs off, and they cannot compete with the cheap corn that's coming from the United States. And so we believe and I think there's good reason for believing it, that it has pushed at least 1.5 million people off the land. The small peasant farmers pushed them off the land. Two things happen. One is they got to go to the city to find a job. The other thing that's happened is they're coming to the United States. So in one sense, our own trade policies have contributed to this issue. I think it's important to realize that. Now, is it good for Iowa farmers that we sell a lot of corn? Yeah, it's good for Iowa farmers. It's not so good for the illegal immigration problem that we have. So in one sense, we've done it to ourselves. And now Mexico is dependent on corn. And one of the things we're worried about is that we've talked about yellow corn, and that was a little less protected early on. Now white corn, which is used for food, for human food, is also less protected. And so we're afraid, from our perspective, that the United States is going to begin to really take over that market as well. So I think that's going to be an issue that we're going to have to grapple with. Should Mexico do more for their own people? Absolutely. Pope Benedict, in the statements that he has, which is very supportive of countries, being good to immigrants, the first principle is, which we'll talk about here in a second, is that people really do have the right to opportunities in their own country. And ideally, the United States and Mexico, because we're kind of the powerful partner in a lot of ways, the United States and Mexico will work together to help there be more opportunities in Mexico than have been currently. But we don't get to tell Mexico what to do. This is something that Mexico has to decide in a lot of respects for themselves. Okay? Let's talk a little bit about and how this all comes to bear. A little bit about Catholic social teaching. Our Catholic social teaching starts with Scripture, and then particularly within the last 125 years or so, there's been a big development on the church, and particularly from the popes, talking about the rights of workers and how the economy should run, and the fact that the economy really exists for the person, not the person for the economy. So we have to go back to Scripture, Deuteronomy. We're supposed to welcome the stranger. We're supposed to treat the worker very well. From our Catholic teaching, we talk about ourselves in the Catholic Church as the body of Christ. Okay, we're all in this together, and what affects one person in Mexico affects us. What affects one person in Africa affects us. We're supposed to love our neighbor as Jesus Christ has loved us. And so we have that principle of solidarity. It doesn't matter what race we are, what ethnicity we are, or where we come from. We're all our brother and sisters keepers around the world. And so this is a very important principle that we try to bring to bear on the immigration issue. Now, realize not everybody agrees with this. There are definitely many groups in the country for who the number one thing is, how can we keep taxes low? Okay, that's legitimate. That's public policy stand. That's number one for some folks. The other one is, how are we going to keep our economy rolling? How are we going to keep jobs? That's job one, for some groups. But for us, one of our base principles is that everybody is made in the image of God, and we're all our brother and sisters keepers. We talked a little bit about how people should have the opportunity in their own homeland. In many respects, they don't want to be here. Good friend of mine, Wang Meng Lee, came from Cambodia. He was an officer in the war. Okay, he ended up, he had to come to the United States as a refugee. He loves the United States, has been here for 30 years, but he still in his heart wants to go back home. But with the situation there, he can't. And so I think it's important to remember, not everybody comes here because they want to stay here forever. They're coming here because they feel like they have to, or because there's an opportunity in this country. So people have a right to opportunities in their own land. Now, people have a right to migrate to support their family. People have a right to find work if they need to support their family. And so we talk about different, differing things that we need to talk about and competing principles. We've already got two right there, that opportunity. And then we've got our country that has a right to have a solid border. And we should have a solid border. There's no doubt about that. So putting this all together, it makes it difficult for us to figure out what's the best public policy that we can have. And we'll have to keep talking about that, which we will do. A couple other principles is we do want to protect the refugees and the asylum seekers. The human rights and the human dignity of the person should never be violated. That simply means that people do have a right in our society to have shelter and food and education and health care, the things that make living, a genuinely human life. That's important. And then finally, as I said, the economy must serve the person, not the person, the economy. We're not some kind of cog in a globalized wheel, to keep everybody's economy going. All of these policies should be looked at how they affect the person. So we see these competing rights, and if you look at them and think about them for a while, there's a lot of debate about what's the right public policy. But I think you can understand why advocates like myself and the church, why we think that our current immigration system is unjust. We think our current system is unjust and that there should be some changes that are made in that. So we start with that premise. So the question is, these are the principles, and many, many people agree with the principles. And many people in this room agree with the principles. The problem is going to be, how do we actually apply that to public policy? That's where the fights begin, and that's where the big debates begin. How do we actually apply these neat principles to our public policy? And this is what the bishops say about that. Some ideas for reform. The right thing to do is to develop a system that helps facilitate the flow of labor from, let's say, Mexico to the United States for those people who really want to have employment opportunities. We want a solution that's based on the dignity of the human person, not based on scoring some political point with somebody. And we think we can do that by working on the economics of the situation. Talk about global anti-poverty efforts, and once again, trade agreements that provide good conditions for workers. That's the number one thing. Secondly, we're looking for an earned legalization. Some people would call that amnesty. I would call that forgiveness. I call that Christian forgiveness. And that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some reasonable requirements for people who would get this amnesty. There would have to be. You might have a stay and pay program where people that end up in this program would have to pay, to stay, in the acknowledgement of the fact that there being a new part of our system is going to cost some money down the road. We'd like to find a pathway to work for those lower skilled folks who would like to come here and do the work that it seems to be difficult to find people in the United States to do in some instances. And as we saw before, we really don't have enough visas to make that happen right now. 5,000 is not the right number. I don't know what the right number is. Is it 100,000? Is it 50,000? I'm not sure, but I think that's something that we kind of have to fight out. We do want to maintain that family-based immigration. There are definitely some groups out there that would like to focus a program totally on employment-based. We would like to keep that family-based because that's another one of our Catholic social teaching principles is the family and the community. And so it's important for family members to stay together as much as they can. And then finally, to enforce the labor protections in all countries that we already have. In the United States, we have a minimum wage. Good example, though, I was on a conference call with some folks a couple weeks ago. In New York, they did kind of a street. In one neighborhood, they did a street-by-street check. Were people paying the minimum wage? Less than half of the businesses were paying the minimum wage. And so these are things that would tend to raise the standard of living and, in fact, make it less likely for people to hire immigrants who are undocumented. So it's important to have that kind of enforcement from our perspective. Now, you realize, as well as I do, this is the ideal, okay? We're talking about politics now. We're not going to get everything that we want as advocates, where there's going to have to be some give and take. But we think that these ideas for reform would be better than some others because it addresses the economics of the issue. It addresses the real reason why people are coming to this country. And one of the things that they didn't do in 1986, and some of you who are kind of old like me remember 1986, where they did an amnesty, okay? The thing they didn't do is change the number of visas, so people could work. They legalized 3 million people. Great, but they didn't fix the system. And that's why we think we need to take another crack at it and actually work on the system and see what we can do with that. And in this way, in all respects, I would say, it's going to be cheaper to do this than just to build a bigger, better border in our minds. What to do about enforcement. And this really is the bugaboo, I think. And one of the most difficult things or questions that I think are out there for advocates, for the church, for the people who want to get tough is, what's the right level of enforcement? If you put it on a continuum between the way it is now and then building a 20-foot wall everywhere, or having immigration raids, what's the right answer? And I don't think we have exactly the right answer. I think part of the answer is going to be in having a decent number of visas, because once there's a real chance for people to do it the right way, they will. And we won't need to worry so much about the border, but this still is a question. And we could look at some other options. We could look at doing nothing. We could just let things go the way they've been doing, which I don't think is healthy in terms of public policy to have that. But we could do nothing. The other thing we could do is we could deport everyone who's here illegally. And people say that we couldn't do it. Well, we could. We can spend $12 billion a month in Iraq. We can spend $12 billion a month and round everybody up and send them back. Don't think it's a good idea, okay? But we certainly can do it if we put our minds to it. So we think we want to find something that's going to fix this issue as best we can, an imperfect solution, but fix it in the most just way possible. Just to highlight a little bit about legislation and what's been happening, I think you remember in 2007 there was a big push for immigration reform, and something what I consider to be very shocking happened. That immigration reform push did not happen. And how many times do you have the President of the United States and the business elite in our country and the advocates in the church all saying, let's have reform, we're making a big push for it, and then it doesn't happen? Businesses didn't get what they want. The president didn't get what he wants. We didn't get what we wanted. Immigrants didn't get what they wanted. It very rarely happens that the grassroots rise up and put a stop to something. But that's exactly what happened. It may have been a minority of people, but they were a very committed minority of people that contacted their legislators and put a stop to it. And I think we need to recognize that. I mean, you even look at the bailout last week. They did not get it through the first time. The president wanted it. Bipartisan people wanted it. They didn't get it through the first time, but they got it through the second time. That didn't happen with immigration reform. So that was just kind of an unusual situation. Right now it's stalled because the elections, for the most part, there's different proposals that are floating around out there, but they're not going to move before the election, and I doubt they'll move after. And there was some thought that we would see some movement, in 2009 with the new president. But with the economic situation, we just don't know. Is this going to come to the front burner at all or not? What are the possibilities going to be? The interesting thing is, and the reason you're not hearing about this in the presidential campaign very much, is it really isn't a winning issue. People imagine that to be tough is a winning issue. It hasn't proven to be that so far. That's number one. Number two is both Senator Obama and Senator McCain both are generally in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. And in fact, I think if Senator McCain gets elected, whatever else you want to say about the situation, I think there's a better chance that we'll have reform if he's elected than if Senator Obama, because I think there'll be other priorities that'll get in line first. You have a Senator McCain with what's likely to be a very Democratic Congress. That's about the one issue that they probably could get together on that I can think of. So we don't know what's going to happen. We know we're going to have to be prepared for compromise, and it'll be something where we'll have to be prepared to work for this if the moment's right. In the states, many states worked on immigration bills in the last year. There were over 1,100 bills that were filed all around the country, dealt with a lot of issues. Some of it was state and local enforcement of federal law, penalties for harboring and transporting immigrants who are here illegally, employment pieces, how they receive benefits. Some states, a few states actually did pass some negative laws, but most states didn't. Oklahoma, they passed a very, what we considered to be a draconian law. In fact, it was so bad that the Archbishop there, Archbishop Beltran, just said, we're not going to follow it. He felt it would put Catholic Charities in danger, doing the work that they do with immigrants on a daily basis, and he just said, we're not going to follow it. I'd never want to get into that situation in Iowa if I can help it, but that's the level of interest that I think you will see that the Catholic Church has on this issue, and they see it very, very, very clearly as standing up for people who are very vulnerable, and that's why the Church cares about this so much. Here in Iowa, and my friend Judy Hoffman's in the audience, worked very hard on this too, from the Interfaith Alliance. There were several attempts to pass what we thought were negative bills, and we were dragging our feet on all of those. It looked at different things like employer sanctions and tightening up the law on independent contractors. They did some work on making sure that people who are here illegally couldn't get bail. It ended up to be a very bad bill in the Iowa House. It did pass in the Iowa House. It did not get through the Senate. The Senate passed a bill which did not get through the Iowa House. And so from our perspective, that was the best outcome that we could have had, is that we didn't have the bad bill get passed. And one thing I think it's important, what's the big deal about punishing employers who hire? Well, in one sense, there's no big deal. It's illegal, so yeah, punish. Our perspective is, federal law does have sanctions against that sort of thing. Federal law does control immigration, so we really shouldn't muck around it, with that in the state of Iowa. We don't have the expertise in immigration law among the staff and the police and all those folks that ICE has. So it would not be a good idea for the state of Iowa to get into that. And we thought it would make it more difficult for the immigrants themselves. And we know that racial profiling does happen in Iowa. It happens at state agencies sometimes. It happens in businesses, and we didn't want to make it more difficult for immigrants, while at the same time we're trying to get this reform passed at the national level. So that was that was kind of the work that we did here in the state. Then after the session, something else happened. And I have the question, did Postville change the equation? I think many of you, probably all of you, heard about the situation in Postville, Iowa. There was an agri-processor's meatpacking plant. There was a sweeping raid that came in from the federal government, kind of a military-style raid. They swept up about 400 employees, which is about 1/5 of the town. And if you think about that, what's 1/5 of Ames? How many people? What would that look like? About 1/5 of the town was swept up on immigration charges and identity theft charges. What happened was they took refuge, for the most part, at St. Bridget's Catholic Church there for several days. Hundreds of people were there. We saw many problems with actually the implementation of justice. It's one thing to enforce the law, okay, and I do support enforcing the law. But enforcing the law like this, where we have, and I don't think it's too strong to say, it's kind of assembly line justice, where you've got each of the judges and the defense attorneys and folks have a script of what to follow and how to adjudicate those things, and they kind of ran them through like in one respects very much like cattle to try to deal with that. Families were separated. Families couldn't find out where the other family members were. Kids were just gone from school. I mean, if you talk to the principal of Postville, all of a sudden there's 10 kids gone out of the class. It really is, from our perspective, it really was a disaster. I wouldn't call it a natural disaster because it was done very deliberately, but it was a disaster. Very traumatic for the town. Now, we can say, obviously, were they breaking the law? Yes, the people from Guatemala, many of them did not have their papers, if not most. But what are the mitigating circumstances? They didn't really, honestly, they didn't know in so many respects what a Social Security number even was. Can you really charge them for stealing it if they don't know what it even is? So, and to the credit of the government, they are having some charges against the company as well. But this is an example of, did it change the equation in Iowa for having reform here in Iowa? We don't know the answer to that. I suspect it has a little bit. The first reaction to that raid was kind of from government was, yeah, right on, let's enforce the law. And then as people saw what happened, and people could not go back home to Guatemala, they were obligated to stay here, but they could not work, so they had no way to support themselves, and they were supported totally by the team of churches that was working in the area. People looked at that and said, this is nuts. And it got to the point in a couple instances where ICE actually gave some people, if you can believe it, they gave them temporary visas to work. So, the mind, you can't make that stuff up, And I understand the government wants to enforce the law, and that's a good thing. But military-style raids isn't to do it. My suspicion is there's enough people in Iowa who looked at that monkey business and thought, we don't really need to have more of that in Iowa. We need to have less of that in Iowa. And that's the perspective I would take on that. We'll just have to see where we end up in terms of the legislative session next year. Just very quickly before we have some time for questions, I do want to talk to you about a couple ideas that we've been starting to develop for the state of Iowa. As I said before, immigration, employment, and control of immigration is really at the federal level, not at the state level. So from our perspective, there's a certain things that the state can do that we'll be advocating for. Some positive things would be making people eligible for health insurance, even legal immigrants, making them eligible for health insurance. I'm trying to get some more funding for English language learners. We talk a lot about people needing to learn English, and I think the people who are here are. But let's talk about more funding so more nonprofit organizations can work on helping with those programs. Increased wage enforcement. We only have, the last I heard, we had like 2 people in the state working on wage enforcement. That would be a way that would help us have less immigration like that. We've also talked to some other ideas about having a driver's license for immigrants, even if they're here illegally. And the good piece of that is, and if you talk to a lot of cops, they're in favor of it because it's very important for them to have good communication with all immigrants so crimes can be solved. And then you do have an ID and you know who they are. So that's something that we might want to work on too. I have no idea yet whether any of these will gain any traction. The Iowa House Democrats have already come out with an agenda for next year that talks of more of the same from last year. We're not quite sure if this is, kind of more for campaign, distribution right now rather than actually what they want to do during the session, but we're going to need to investigate that some more. But I would certainly, invite your ideas, and at question time, what do you think? What's good for the state of Iowa? Knowing the whole situation and learning a little bit more about what's going on, what would your priorities be? I'd like to have you think about that for a minute before we do the questions. And then basically it's going to be up to you. Here in Iowa, you folks can still make a difference with your legislators. If they get contacted, if a particular legislator gets contacted by 4 or 5 people personally with email, maybe visiting them, at the Capitol, that still has a big impact in this state, and I would really encourage you to do that as much as you can. From our perspective, our nation's border policies have been ineffective. They've resulted in many deaths at the border. Our system right now says to millions of people, go back to the poverty where you came from. And for this country to say that, I think we have so many gifts and resources that we can still offer, and we should do better than that, and we can do better than that with your help. All right. Any questions or concerns or comments? I'd love to hear from it and have a good dialogue.
Do I have to tell my name or anything? I just wanted to know what exactly makes the Catholic Church a authority on immigration.
That's a great question. From our perspective, we've got, and this goes across the whole of human experience, we've got hundreds of years of dealing with the poor, from the hospitals in Europe to the missionaries, to the Catholic Charities that we have in the United States. Catholic Charities USA is the largest non-governmental social services agency in the country. The Catholic Healthcare Ministry is the largest non-governmental healthcare ministry in the country. And so over the past, literally over the past centuries, we've got a lot of experience in working with the human condition. And so that's, from our perspective, we've got something to offer. We're not the only group, but that's something to offer.
Someone up here had a question.
Yeah, right here.
You stated that we have 5,000 unskilled visas allowed per year. Who controls that number? Is it the executive branch federally or the legislative branch? Or
It would have to be changed in the law.
so legislatively?
Legislatively we would need a change. The other thing I should add to that is there is a separate program for agricultural workers, that we call migrant workers. That is a separate program, and there's many more visas available for that on a temporary basis, for people to come to the United States and work and then go back. That's separate from that 5,000, but I just wanted to add that.
Do you know how old that number is? Like
The 5,000 number?
Yeah, was it 100 years ago?
Oh, it's been the better part of a decade, and I'll just say that. The last time they really did a go-around on the immigration laws was 1996, so my suspicion would be it would be that long, and if someone else knows differently, I'd be interested to hear it, but I would guess 96.
I
I don't know if this is a question or more of a comment, but
Sure.
I think that the Iowa reform ideas that you have on this sheet, they are great, but I think that what we need to change. I'm an immigrant. I'm from originally from Mexico, and I'm a graduate student here in Iowa State. But it seems like to me like what we need to do to start with before we can actually start working on this state legislation is to change the people's perspective of immigrants. I think they almost are like demonizing them. So certainly any legislation with a mentality like that is not going to pass. So at this particular point in time, anything is like an immigrant. It's almost like, and I think that's part of the federal government tactics that they use sometimes, that they pair them up with terrorists, they pair them up with people abusing the system, and so on and so forth. So I think that the churches, and not only Catholic Church, but any other organization, institution, or religious institution, responsibility is to change that particular view, because if you look at the gospel teachings, I mean, that's basically it's like we are the same. And so it's very interesting to see that what we need to change is just the perspective of immigrants, I think.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Certainly within, and I'll just speak for the Catholic Church because that's where I'm a member, certainly we've got work to do within the Catholic Church, on that issue. These websites, particularly if you look at iowaimmigrationeducation.org, that is a great coalition of people who have come together to put together some really facts on immigration here in Iowa. If you go to that website, you can get that. And so it's really front and center for us to try to do this education. I would agree, because you're not going to convince somebody who thinks that they're just kind of getting over to get here. You're not going to convince them until you walk it back and say there really is no easy way to get here or even a difficult way to get here. And once people understand that, then they kind of get off the negative a little bit. But that is an issue. Great point.
To advocate to change the law is one thing, but to advocate to break the law is entirely another thing. And as I understand what you're proposing is to advocate to break the law.
I don't think in what respect?
Illegal immigration.
Yeah, I'm not advocating for that. What I'm saying is it's happening, and we do definitely need to deal with it. I would not advocate for breaking the law.
Okay, I'm glad to understand
Just to be clear.
that.
Can you wait just a second? If we have the questions
We
on
want the mic.
then they get recorded.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I mean, I just wanted to add something about what he said, because, like I said, I was born in Venezuela, and thanks to those who have immigrated to this country illegally, we all have to pay for that. I mean, I know that people that come here legally from Mexico are also affected by that. I mean, it affects me, and it's just we need to change the perspective, because we all have to remember that. I mean, everybody, even all of you, I think you have all, international backgrounds, and you were all immigrants at some point, or your grandparents, great-parents, whatever. They all were immigrants at some point, and they all came here for better opportunities and better lives, and that's one thing that, it definitely has to change. Of course, I know there's people that are kind of, well, not precisely closed-minded, but they just were taught that, precisely illegal immigration was not the right way to do it, but I want to emphasize that, that if we do change the perspective on, immigration, and it can certainly make a difference, and not all immigrants are illegal. And like you said yourself, we have to find a balance. Not only immigrants get benefits, but they also contribute into society, and I think that's important.
All right, well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.